Lately, I've been watching a show about portrait artists, and today I'd like to talk a little about what they do that's connected to the season of Lent. Stay tuned. Hello, friends. Pastor Tim Westermeyer here, Senior Pastor of St. Philip the Deacon in the western suburbs of Minneapolis. Good to be with you as always. I don't know if this is true for you, but my wife and I get sort of hooked on different TV series. And by the way, if any of you have recommendations, we're always looking for the next one. And sort of by accident, we got hooked on this show or a series of shows produced in Great Britain, in England, I guess, called Portrait Artist of the Year. Maybe we'll link to one of those episodes. You can see a lot of them on YouTube. So the idea, if you know the Great British Baking Show, it's sort of like that, but rather than chefs or cooks baking things, it's what you would expect. It's people who are artists or portrait artists coming together. They have a bunch of different sort of preliminary rounds. They choose a handful of finalists, and then they have the semifinals, and ultimately they pick someone. Now, here's the interesting thing. I don't really know anything about how to paint or draw, but I find it interesting to watch people who are expert at it. And you would assume, okay, well, I'm watching a show about portrait artists. What are you going to watch? You would assume, well, I'm watching people put paint on a canvas or using graphite on paper, or there are some other folks who do even more creative ways of creating images. And that is true, but a lot of what you watch is the artists observing, paying attention, studying the individual they're going to draw, paying attention to the way the light patterns reflect on their faces or the colors of their faces or how they're going to compose the final painting. So before they ever put the first paintbrush of paint on the canvas, they're spending a lot of time, again, observing. So this got me thinking about the season we find ourselves in. Again, we're in the season of Lent. Ash Wednesday was the week before the week we're taping this. We just had the first Sunday of Lent this past weekend. And you may know this, but the Sunday reading in the first Sunday of Lent always begins with Jesus' temptation in the wilderness, right? So Jesus is baptized. This is sort of the first public act of ministry, right? He's baptized in the River Jordan by his cousin John. He hears the voice of God saying, "This is my beloved Son. In him I am well pleased." And you might think, okay, well, that seems like a pretty big commission to go out and do stuff, to get about the work of ministry. But the first thing Jesus does is he goes into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, praying, thinking, preparing, reflecting on what exactly this is that God is sending him to do. And of course, that's patterned in a way on the 40 years of wilderness wanderings in the Old Testament, where the Hebrew people are freed from Egypt, and you'd think, okay, let's go get after it. Let's start doing whatever it is that God wants us to do. But instead, what do? They spend 40 years in the wilderness preparing for their freedom. So this makes me reflect, in our culture, I think we have a bias towards action. And there are times when that's a good and appropriate thing. And I think here of I think it was General George Patton, who's this is attributed to, but he says, a good plan violently executed today is better than a perfect plan executed next week, right? And I think we sort of live with that truth that, well, we have to go do something. And again, maybe that's a conversation for another episode, but I think it's also true that sometimes we need to pause. We need to wait. We need to listen. We need to observe. And I want to suggest today that Lent is a beautiful season to do all of those things. My dear colleague, Pastor Valerie Strand-Patterson, preached this last Sunday. Maybe we'll link to the entire sermon. But one of the things she said, and again, this was the first Sunday of Lent, she says this: every year of our lives, we have a beautiful and, in my imagination, sort of softly glowing time that lasts about 6 weeks. It's the season of Lent. It's the springtime for our souls, she says. And springtime, I'm not a gardener. I'm not a portrait artist. I'm not a gardener. But I reflect on sort of springtime as the opportunity for the plants that are getting ready to burst forth to prepare for that, right? They're not coming up out of the ground yet. They're sort of gathering nourishment. They're waiting for the longer days and the sun to come out. And I want to sort of, I guess, give us permission as people of faith during this season of Lent not to be so focused on doing, but more focused on observing, on listening, on reflecting, on preparing, on considering what is God asking me to do, so that when the 40 days of Lent are up, let's say, we might be better prepared to do it. That's what I want to share with you today. Be well, stay in touch, and God bless.